man who had already lost his arm to a lion still walked back into the cage every single night, and the people who worked beside him knew exactly what was coming. The week before his final performance, he told his wife he was afraid of one of his lions, and that lion was waiting for him in the ring. So, why did Thomas Macarte step inside anyway? And what happened in those 15 minutes that nobody could stop? Thomas Macarte had one arm. The left one was gone, taken by a lioness years before when he walked too close to a cage in Liverpool. The bite was so deep and the damage so bad that doctors had no choice but to cut the arm off at the shoulder. Most men would have walked away from lions forever after that. Thomas Macarte went back to work with them the very next season. He had spent most of his adult life inside cages with big cats, and he was not the kind of man who changed course easily. People who knew him said he was bold in a way that made other men nervous. Not brave exactly, but reckless. The kind of bold that comes from ignoring danger so many times that you start to believe the danger has forgotten about you. He had joined Mander's menagerie after the death of their famous lion tamer, a man named Macomo, whose reputation had filled every tent he ever performed in. Macarte was brought in to replace him, and the pressure was immediate. The crowds expected the same thrills. The owner expected the same crowds. Macarte worked with lions from his very first day, 5 full-grown African males that had known another man's hand before his. He had not yet earned their trust, and he knew it. So colleagues noticed that he seemed uneasy around the animals in a way that a man of his experience should not have been. He was quick to look away. He turned his back on the lions while they were still watching him, something every experienced trainer knew never to do. The other workers warned him again and again. He nodded and kept doing it. The week before January 3rd, one of the lions bit him during a routine session. It was not a glancing scratch. The animal got hold of him and left marks that were still raw and tender when the final performance came. That night, before he left the house, Macarte sat with his wife and told her plainly that he was frightened of that lion. She heard it in his voice. He was not being dramatic, he meant it. She watched him walk out the door at around 2 in the afternoon. He told her he would be back for tea. He never came home. What his wife could not have known, and what the 500 people packing into the Bolton Marketplace tent that cold January night could not have known either, was that the heated iron rods that could drive a lion back from a fallen man were sitting cold and useless in a corner. Nobody had prepared them. This was an extra performance added to the schedule at the last moment, and in the rush, that one detail had been missed. The detail that would cost Thomas Macarte everything. The Bolton Marketplace on the night of January 3rd, 1872 was loud and warm and smelled of sawdust and animal musk, and the sweat of 500 people pressed together under canvas in the middle of winter. Gas lamps threw orange light across the crowd. Children sat in the front rows with their mouths already open. Parents stood at the back with arms folded, waiting for the act they had paid to see. Mander's menagerie had billed this as a farewell performance, the last chance to witness Macarte, the lion tamer, before the show moved on. The name on the posters was Macarte. The man behind the name was Thomas Macarte, 34 years old, one arm, and afraid. The iron cage sat at the center of the performance space, its bars thick and dark against the gaslight. Inside it, 5 full-grown African lions moved in the slow, restless way that big cats move when they are aware of a crowd but not yet performing. Their paws were the size of dinner plates. Their shoulders rolled when they walked. The largest of them, a black-maned Barbary male, he settled near the back wall and watched the entrance to the ring with flat, yellow eyes. This was the animal that had bitten Macarte the week before. This was the animal Macarte had told his wife he feared. Macarte entered the ring dressed as a Roman gladiator. He wore a short tunic and carried a sword in his one hand. His other side was empty where an arm should have been. In his belt, he carried a pistol loaded with blank rounds, standard equipment for driving lions back, with noise when they grew bold. He gave his usual talk to the audience first, moving along the outside of the cage and pointing to each animal in turn. His voice was steady. His face gave nothing away. The crowd did not know he was frightened. They saw only the showman they had come to see. He stepped inside the cage at around 10:30 at night. The door was secured behind him. The 5 lions turned toward him as one. What the audience saw next was a performance that began like every other performance. Macarte moving through the animals, directing them with gestures and sound, the lions responding in the reluctant, unpredictable way that made the act dangerous enough to be exciting. The crowd leaned forward. The children in the front rows gripped each other. The gas lamps hissed above the tent. Nobody in that building was thinking about iron rods or missed preparations or a quiet conversation between a frightened man and his wife earlier that afternoon. They were thinking about the show, and for a few minutes, the show was exactly what they expected. Then, Thomas Macarte's foot slipped on the sawdust floor, and everything changed. He went down fast. One moment, he was upright, and the next, he was on the ground, his body dropping sideways onto the sawdust with a sound the people nearest the cage heard clearly over the noise of the crowd. The black-maned Barbary lion moved before Macarte had finished falling. There was no pause, no hesitation. The animal crossed the cage in 3 strides and was on him before he could push himself upright. It hit him with its full weight, which witnesses later estimated at well over 400 pounds, and the impact drove him flat against the floor. The other 4 lions came within seconds, not because they planned it or coordinated it, but because a lion on the ground triggers something in every other lion nearby. It is instinct, older than memory. The cage became a mass of moving bodies, tawny and dark, pressing down on the figure of a man who was fighting back with everything he had. Macarte swung his sword. He fired the pistol into the air once, twice, the blank rounds cracking loud enough to make the front row flinch. The lions did not retreat. The blanks that might startle an animal with room to run meant nothing to animals pressed together in a cage with prey already down. People in the crowd did not understand what they were seeing at first. Some thought it was part of the act. Then they heard Macarte scream, and they understood. A reporter from the Manchester Evening News was in the audience that night and wrote later that the sounds coming from inside the cage were barely human, that they cut through the roaring of the lions and reached every corner of the tent. Women pulled children away from the front rows. The men at the back pushed forward, trying to see. The tent filled with screaming that mixed with the lions until it was impossible to tell one from the other. The workers outside the cage ran for the iron rods. They were cold. A fire had to be built to heat them. And while that fire was being built, Thomas Macarte was on the floor of the cage with 5 lions on top of him. The minutes passed. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10. The crowd that had not fled stood frozen, watching the bars of the cage and the shapes moving behind them. Macarte resurfaced once, dragged toward the inner cage door by the animals, his voice still audible, still calling out, though the words were no longer clear. 15 minutes after he fell, the rods were hot enough. The workers drove the lions back, pushing them through the inner door one by one until the cage was clear. They found Macarte alive, barely. His body had been torn in ways that the newspaper accounts of the time declined to describe in full. The men who pulled him out carried him quickly away from the cage, away from the crowd, out into the January night. He looked up at the men holding him and said, clearly enough that they all heard it, "I am done for." He was right. He died before they reached the hospital. The lion that killed Thomas Macarte did not die with him. It lived for another 2 years inside Mander's menagerie, performing in new towns with a new trainer, and somewhere along the way, it picked up a name. People started calling it Macarte's lion, as though the killing had made the animal famous in a way the man never quite managed to be. When it finally died of natural causes in January 1874, exactly 2 years after the attack, the menagerie did not bury it quietly. They brought in a taxidermist named Roland Ward, one of the most respected in England, and had the lion stuffed and mounted in a pose called a wounded lion. The marks from the fight were still visible on its body. Ward placed it in the front window of his shop on Piccadilly in London, and crowds stopped on the pavement to stare at it. Macarte was buried in the Roman Catholic section of Tongue Cemetery in Bolton. Mrs. Rosina Manders, who owned the menagerie, paid for a white marble monument placed over his grave. The inscription called him the Great Lion Tamer. No inquest found any criminal fault. No new safety rules followed his death. The show moved to the next town. Other trainers took his place. The cold iron rods that might have saved him were never mentioned in the official record. What is left of Thomas Macarte is a grave with a marble cross, a stuffed lion in a long-closed London shop, and a story about a man who knew the danger better than anyone in that tent and walked into it anyway. He had survived a lion taking his arm. He had felt the bite of that black-maned Barbary male just days before he died. He had sat with his wife and told her the truth. And then he put on his Roman gladiator costume, picked up his sword, and stepped inside the cage one final time. The 500 people who watched him die went home that night and told the story to everyone they knew. The lions went back to their cages, and the next morning the menagerie opened again.